Let's begin this section by first defining the word ecosystem. An ecosystem is the interaction of groups of living organisms with the physical environment. And some of the factors in the physical environment that they need are food, water, air, shelter, and space. These organisms are found in communities too. We have aquatic communities, which could be creeks, ponds, estuaries, or the ocean. And we have the terrestrial communities, which could be the desert, the grasslands, the chaparral, or the forest. Now this whole ecology principle is really a flow of energy, and it starts with the sun. The energy from the sun goes to the plants, and the plants produce food. They make sugar with this sun energy. These are the producers. Then we have the consumers, animals that eat plants. And then of course we have animals that eat other animals, so they're getting this sun energy indirectly. And then finally the third leg of this energy flow are the decomposers, the bacteria and the fungi. And these life forms break down the dead material and put nutrients back into the soil for the plants to use again to get the energy back around. We can study further this idea by looking at food chains and food webs. And once again we'll go to these boards that were used in the primary grades. These are simply just pieces of wood with 9 long finishing nails hammered in at random locations. Take a piece of paper and lay it over the nails and press down on it so that the nails pop through, and then mark the nail holes with a pencil. This will be your template. You can use this template to make other boards that match this one. You should have about 1 board for every 3 students when you work in your groups. The other thing you can do with the template is make handout sheets. This first one is called What Do Living Things Depend On? And I have 4 main items: sun, water, food, and shelter. I also have some plants and animals listed around them. The first thing students will do with their handout sheet is to punch out all 9 holes with their pencil. And the safest way to do that is to put the paper on the table, bend it upward, and press the pencil into the proper hole till they get all 9 punched out. And then lay it over their template sheet so that it slides down on it. Now what they need to do is look at the object and see what it needs. If it needs something like sunlight, then you tie a piece of yarn onto the plant and connect it to the sun. Fish don't need sun as much as plants do, so we probably won't put a piece of yarn there. But fish certainly need water, so we'll connect fish to water. After you connect all these up, you'll get something that looks like this. It looks pretty complicated, but it certainly tells a story. First, it shows that all of these life forms rely on water because they're all connected to the water supply. If we cut off the water supply, then every one of these pieces of yarn would be cut, and all of these life forms would die. You can do a similar analysis on the shelter or food aspect of this handout too. And you can use the same boards to investigate food chains and food webs. Here's a typical food chain handout. This one has producers, consumers, and decomposers on it. Once again, students will stick it on the board and make connections. First, let's take a look at the food chain, and rather than go through all the trouble with the yarn, I'll just draw some arrows here. The question that we will ask is, what does each organism use for food? We'll follow the energy flow from the sun throughout this system. The spinach first uses sun energy for food, then man eats the spinach. We'll follow the energy up to the mosquito, the dragonfly, down to the frog, over to the snake, across to the hawk, and then finally up to the decomposers. They break down dead organisms into nutrients that plants can use. Now we don't live off spinach alone, nor do frogs live only on dragonflies. So we get to the next concept, which are food webs. It's like a supermarket of food sources, and it's a much more involved inner relationship between different life forms. Let's take a look at what a food web would look like. Here you see 2 types of plants, grasses and shrubs, both of which are eaten by deer, sheep, and rabbits. The deer in turn may be food for man or mountain lion, and the sheep and rabbits are consumed by the wolves, the mountain lion, and man. Food webs can become disrupted when 1 or 2 of the food sources disappear. It can really change the population. For example, what would happen if the deer and the rabbit disappeared? Well, then the mountain lion would have to rely more heavily on the sheep for food, and you can see what that would cause. All of these questions can be good classroom discussion questions. Now let's take a look at 2 activities to help us further understand food chains and food webs. For this first activity, we'll take a unique and fun approach. You're the president of a company, Eggshells Incorporated, and all of your students are hired by the company as scientists to solve problems. The problem that they need to solve is how thick is an eggshell. Here you're going to ask them to come up with a solution to the problem. Let them brainstorm it for about 10 or 15 minutes. Talk about it in class. How would you measure the thickness of an eggshell? Now, they might not come up with an actual solution, but you will see the advantages of having this brainstorm session, advantages in communication skills and problem-solving methods. You should help them to discover solutions or possible solutions by leading them through different paths of inquiry. For example, you might talk about pennies. Let's say you have a whole pile of pennies and you have one stack that's 10 pennies high. How would you figure out how many total pennies you have? Well, everybody's done that. They just make a bunch of similar stacks. Here we're counting by measuring height. Now let's go to the next step of our directed approach. What if we had a stack of eggshell fragments that was the same height as the stack of 10 pennies? Do you think we'd have more than 10 or less than 10 eggshells? Well, hopefully your students will say more than 10 because they can relate an eggshell to the thickness of a penny, and they know that eggshells are thinner than pennies. But we still really haven't come up with the answer. We've only made a comparison to the thickness of a penny, that it's thinner than a penny. So we need to go to the next step. What if we had, instead of a height of 10 pennies, we had the height of 1 centimeter, and we knew exactly how many eggshells were in that 1 centimeter height? Could we then figure out the thickness of one eggshell? Well, let's say, for example, we had 20 eggshells in 1 centimeter. Wouldn't one eggshell then be 1/20th of a centimeter? There's the solution. Now we need to actually do the problem and see what we come up with. Here students can work in groups of 2. They can take a plate like this and have one eggshell and break it up into small pieces. Glue the pieces together one on top of the other with a glue stick until you get a 1/2 centimeter, so you can have each person in the group glue up a 1/2 centimeter stack. When you check it out here, lay your metric ruler right next to the stack to see if it equals a 1/2 centimeter. After they've done that, they can check their results to see if they have the number that they thought they had with a magnifier by counting the number of layers of eggshell in their stack. Make sure they record their results because you're going to put all of the group's results on the board. You should find some variance in the thicknesses of the eggshells. Now, what does this all have to do with food chains and food webs? Well, pesticides can affect the thickness of eggshells. And when insects are sprayed with pesticides like DDT, birds eat the insects and the pesticide builds up inside the bird and it results in very thin eggshells. Some eggshells so thin that the animal, the young, can't survive. The eggshell actually breaks before it's hatched. Now for our next investigation, and it's a gold star activity, one that students will remember you for. Here we're going to be investigating owl pellets. Now, what are owl pellets in the first place? Well, when owls eat food, they usually swallow the food whole. Perhaps they've eaten a mouse. After about 24 hours, the stomach digests most of the fleshy part of the animal, and then the owl regurgitates the remains. Usually it's very delicate and hardly disturbed at all. You get the skeletal bones and the fur in one little ball. This is an owl pellet. People go out and collect these and sell them in kits. This package contains 15 owl pellets, some dissecting tools, and instructions for both the teacher and the student. Now, although the pellets are treated with a chemical, it's always a safe practice to remind your students to wash their hands after handling them. Here's what they look like. First, students will measure the length of their pellet and the width. Look closely at it and see if you can see any bones protruding from the inside. Now, some of you are probably thinking right now that I'm not touching that, I'm turning the TV off. But wait a second until you see what we find inside one of these pellets. If your students are working in groups of 2 or 3, have them carefully break a pellet up into 2 or 3 equal segments. Give them 2 plates to work with, one to put the fur on and the other one to put the clean bones on. Now remember, it's almost like an archaeological dig. We have to be very careful and take our time. Emphasize that with your students. When they carefully peel this apart, it might take them 15 minutes to get through their section. The parts they want to preserve the most are the skull and the jaw bones. This way we can see how many animals are inside this owl pellet, and we might be able to identify some of the animals. When I took this one here apart, one of the first things I noticed was a skull protruding from this piece of fur. You can also see the lower jawbone down here. Each animal will have 2 of these jaw bones, so that will help you to tell how many animals are in your owl pellet. Now, rather than let you watch me carefully dissect an owl pellet and take about 15 minutes, let me just show you what I found. Incidentally, they supply these needles in the kit to help you tease away the hair. The first owl pellet I dissected was very interesting. In it, I found what appears to be the remains of a vole. This is similar to a rat, except it has a blunt nose. The skull is the most valuable piece for identifying what the animal is. You also see next to the skull the two jaw bones. I've included a piece of fur too, so that we can compare it to that found in other owl pellets. Here's the vertebrae from the backbone. Then we have a number of tiny little leg bones, and then some bones that connect the leg bones to the backbone, which might be considered to be hip bones or shoulder blades. This tiny bone here could even be a rib. In my second owl pellet, I found two specimens. I could tell because I found two skulls, and also two pair of lower jaw bones. These animals appeared to be mice, and if you look very closely at the leg bone, you see how it connects to the little ball and socket joint of the pelvis. Students can use the worksheet to look at the pictures of the skulls on the back to try and identify what animals they have. Allow the students to walk around and look at the findings of the other groups. Also put the data on the board. Find out how many specimens on the average are found in each owl pellet. Also, what type of food do owls prefer? Now, scientists actually use the owl as the collector to go out and find what type of specimens of animals live in a particular area. All the scientist has to do is evaluate the owl pellet to get the information. If you have a very interested student, you might have them try and reconstruct the skeleton of one of these animals. It would even make a great science fair project. Now, aren't you glad that you didn't turn your TV off a few minutes ago? In fact, I bet there's a number of you out there that are writing little stars by that owl pellet activity. As we wrap up this series in life science, you can see that there's much more to life science than just growing lima beans. There are two other areas of science too that should get equal emphasis: the earth and physical sciences. I hope you get the opportunity to take a look at all of the tapes in this program. It'll give you a very broad base of knowledge in science. Now, you obviously don't have to teach all of these topics, but you should have particular topics in your area, specialties that you should teach, and other teachers at different grades should have theirs. Imagine the amount of information that a student will be exposed to by the time they graduate from the 6th grade.